The Garden Party, Part 1. Once upon a time, in a small town, there lived a family named the Parkers. The Parkers had a beautiful garden behind their house. It was full of colorful flowers, tall trees, and a small pond with fish. Every year, the Parkers hosted a garden party for their friends and neighbors. This year, they wanted to make it the best party ever. Mrs. Parker was the one who planned everything. She loved to organize parties, and she had many ideas to make this garden party special. She decided to start planning early so she wouldn't forget anything. First, Mrs. Parker made a list of all the things she needed. She wrote down food, drinks, decorations, and games. She also made a list of people to invite. She wanted to make sure everyone had a good time, so she thought carefully about what each person might like. One morning, Mrs. Parker went to the local market to buy fresh fruits and vegetables. She picked the ripest apples, the juiciest oranges, and the freshest lettuce. She also bought some flowers to decorate the tables. Mrs. Parker loved flowers, and she knew they would make the garden look even more beautiful. While Mrs. Parker was at the market, Mr. Parker and their two children, Emily and Jack, were busy in the garden. Mr. Parker mowed the lawn, making sure the grass was short and even. Emily and Jack helped by pulling out weeds and planting new flowers. They wanted the garden to look perfect for the party. As the day of the party grew closer, the Parkers started preparing the food. Mrs. Parker baked a big cake with strawberries and cream. Emily and Jack helped by mixing the batter and decorating the cake with fresh berries. Mr. Parker grilled some chicken and vegetables, and they made sandwiches, salads, and fruit platters. The kitchen was filled with delicious smells, and everyone was excited about the party. The night before the party, the Parkers decorated the garden. They hung colorful lights in the trees and set up tables with white tablecloths. Mrs. Parker placed flowers in vases on each table, and Emily and Jack arranged the chairs. Everything looked perfect, and they couldn't wait to see their friends and neighbors enjoying the garden. On the morning of the party, the sun was shining, and the sky was blue. It was the perfect day for a garden party. The Parkers woke up early to make sure everything was ready. Mrs. Parker checked the food, while Mr. Parker set up a music player in the garden. Emily and Jack blew up balloons and hung them around the garden. Finally, it was time for the party to begin. The guests started to arrive, and the garden quickly filled with people. Everyone admired the beautiful garden and the delicious food. The children ran around, playing games and laughing, while the adults talked and enjoyed the sunshine. As the afternoon went on, Mrs. Parker noticed that everyone was having a great time. The food was a big hit, and the games were lots of fun. But there was still more to come. Mrs. Parker had planned a special surprise for the end of the party. She couldn't wait to see the look on everyone's face when they saw it. But that's a story for part 2. In the meantime, The Parkers were happy to see their garden filled with joy and laughter. The garden party was a success, and it wasn't over yet. The Garden Party, Part 2. The garden was alive with the sound of laughter and conversation. The guests were enjoying the delicious food, the warm sunshine, and the beautiful surroundings. Mrs. Parker walked around the garden, making sure everyone had everything they needed. She was pleased to see so many happy faces. But in the back of her mind, she was excited about the big surprise she had planned. As the afternoon turned into early evening, the temperature began to cool, and the sunlight softened. The children, who had been playing games like hide-and-seek and tag, started to gather around a large oak tree where Mr. Parker had set up a few benches. They were curious about the surprise their parents had been whispering about all day. Mrs. Parker gathered everyone together and asked them to take a seat near the oak tree. She smiled as she saw the excited looks on the children's faces. Even the adults were curious. Mrs. Parker loved creating moments like this moments that brought people together and created memories they would cherish for years to come. Thank you all for coming today, Mrs. Parker began. We've had such a wonderful time with all of you. But the party isn't over yet. We have a special surprise for you all. The guests exchanged excited glances as Mrs. Parker turned to Mr. Parker, who gave her a nod and walked toward the shed at the back of the garden. He opened the door and wheeled out a large wooden box. The box was covered with a colorful cloth, and everyone leaned forward to get a closer look. "What's inside?" asked one of the children, unable to contain their excitement. Mrs. Parker smiled. "You'll see in just a moment." Mr. Parker carefully removed the cloth, revealing a beautifully crafted wooden puppet theater. The guests gasped in delight as they saw the small stage with curtains, painted scenery, and tiny props. It was clear that a lot of love and care had gone into making it. "This puppet theater has been in my family for many years," Mrs. Parker explained. "My grandfather built it when I was a little girl, and I used to watch puppet shows with my family in this very garden. Today, we're going to share that tradition with all of you." The children clapped their hands in excitement, and even the adults were eager to see what would happen next. Mrs. Parker's sister, Aunt Lucy, who was known for her storytelling skills, appeared from behind the theater, holding two beautifully crafted puppets, a princess and a dragon. Aunt Lucy loved telling stories, and she was thrilled to be part of this special moment. "Gather around, everyone," Aunt Lucy said with a wink. "It's time for a story." The children sat on the grass in front of the puppet theater, their eyes wide with anticipation. The adults gathered behind them, some sitting on the benches and others standing. The garden was quiet now, with only the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Aunt Lucy began the story. Once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom, there lived a brave princess named Emily. She was known throughout the land for her kindness and her courage. But one day, a fierce dragon appeared in the kingdom, and everyone was afraid. As Aunt Lucy brought the characters to life with her voice and the puppets, the audience was captivated. The children leaned forward, completely absorbed in the story. The adults smiled, remembering the joy of childhood stories. The garden, now bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, seemed to come alive with the magic of the tale. The story continued, with the princess facing many challenges, but always using her bravery and wisdom to overcome them. The dragon, who at first seemed scary, was eventually revealed to be a misunderstood creature who just needed a friend. The story ended with the princess and the dragon becoming best friends and bringing peace to the kingdom. As the story concluded, the audience erupted in applause. The children cheered, and the adults clapped along, impressed by the simple yet meaningful tale. Aunt Lucy took a bow, and Mr. Parker stepped forward to close the curtains on the puppet theater. But the surprises weren't over yet. Mrs. Parker had one final treat for the guests. "Before we end this wonderful day," she said, "we have a special dessert for everyone. Please follow me to the other side of the garden." The guests followed Mrs. Parker to a large table set up near the garden's edge. On the table were bowls filled with all kinds of toppings, sprinkles, chocolate chips, fruit, and more. Next to the table was a big cart filled with ice cream in many different flavors. "We're going to make our own ice cream sundaes," Mrs. Parker announced. The children's eyes lit up, and they quickly lined up to create their perfect sundaes. The adults joined in, laughing as they piled their bowls with their favorite toppings. It was the perfect end to a perfect day. As everyone enjoyed their sundaes, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the garden was illuminated by the soft glow of the lights strung in the trees. The air was filled with the sound of laughter, the clinking of spoons, and the gentle hum of contentment. The garden party had been a huge success. The Parkers looked around at their friends and neighbors, feeling a deep sense of happiness and satisfaction. They had created a day full of joy, laughter, and memories that would last a lifetime. As the guests began to leave, they thanked the Parkers for such a wonderful day. "This was the best garden party ever," said one of the children, hugging Mrs. Parker. Mrs. Parker smiled, her heart full. "I'm so glad you had a good time." That's what today was all about. As the last guests left, the Parkers stood together in the garden, the lights twinkling above them. The garden was quiet now, but it was filled with the warmth and love of the day's events. "I think we did it," Mr. Parker said, wrapping his arm around Mrs. Parker. "We made this garden party the best one yet." Mrs. Parker nodded, feeling content. "Yes, we did. And I can't wait to do it all again next year." With that, the Parkers headed inside, tired but happy. The garden, now peaceful and still, was a reminder of the beautiful day they had shared with their friends and family. And as they went to bed that night, they knew they had created something special that would be remembered for years to come. The end.